Unit 13 is the lymphatic and immune systems. Let's start by listing the functions of the lymphatic system. Earlier in the cardiovascular system, we saw that arterioles bring oxygenated blood, as well as nutrients, water, electrolytes, and so on, into tissues. The arterioles branch to form capillaries, where the nutrient and water and gas exchange occurs. And then deoxygenated blood and wastes coming from those tissues are taken away via the venule. As mentioned during the cardiovascular system as well, here are the tissue cells that ultimately the capillaries are bringing nutrients to and wastes away from. How that happens is fluids leave from the blood into the tissue spaces, called the interstitium. The fluid then, after leaving the cardiovascular system, provides those nutrients, oxygen, sugar, and water to the cells of the tissue. The wastes that are given off by the cells then enter into that fluid from the cells, and most of that fluid actually ends up back in the cardiovascular system. However, not all of it moves back into the blood capillaries. Only approximately 85% of it actually does that. And so there's a further 15% of fluid that doesn't return back into the cardiovascular system. So how do we move that fluid around the body? Another system is the lymphatic system that we're talking about here. We'll look at the vessels involved, but that extra 15% of tissue fluid that does not re-enter into the capillaries is drained by lymphatic capillaries and lymphatic vessels. That fluid is ultimately called lymph when it enters into that system. Here we have the beginnings of the lymphatic system, the lymphatic capillaries. Those lymphatic capillaries collect together, just like cardiovascular capillaries do, and those lymphatic capillaries connect into larger lymphatic vessels. If we move that image off to the side here, we can actually compare and contrast lymphatic and cardiovascular circulation. So here we have blood flow, and we've looked at the cardiovascular system in the previous units. Blood flows out from the heart, out to the capillaries of the body systems, going to either the lungs, in the pulmonary capillary network indicated here, or to the blood capillaries that provide blood to all the systems of the body. Those blood vessels, the capillaries, then collect together to form venules, and then veins, and the blood is returned to the heart. In the lymphatic system, we have lymph flow, this excess fluid from the interstitium, that collects into capillaries, that then collect to lymphatic vessels. However, the lymphatic capillaries, as we can see in the image here, have a point of starting where, unlike the cardiovascular system, where the blood flows out from the heart, there's no artery equivalent side to the lymphatic flow. The lymphatic capillaries start up in the tissues themselves, collecting that excess fluid, and then the lymph flows along the vessels from those capillaries through lymph nodes, which we'll take a closer look at in a little bit, in this fashion. So as you can see, the lymph flows only back towards the heart. Ultimately, the lymphatic vessels empty into blood vessels just prior to them entering into the heart. In this way, the lymphatic system is very similar to the venous system of the cardiovascular system. And there is no artery equivalent to this system. In a few minutes, we'll look at some other comparisons to the venous portion of the cardiovascular system and how it's similar to the lymphatic system. Let's continue by describing lymphatic capillaries. Here's a lymphatic capillary. As you can see, because there's no artery equivalent side to the lymphatic system, the lymph fluid is actually that extra interstitial fluid that comes from the cardiovascular system into the tissue space. The lymphatic capillaries are blunt-ended. They just start up, as opposed to being attached to anything prior to them. They're made up of a single layer of overlapping endothelial cells, just like we saw in capillaries. They have anchoring fibers, which allow them to attach to the other cells within the tissue. They have spaces, Where those overlapping endothelial cells come together, there are clefts, little spaces where the interstitial fluid enters the lymphatic capillary because it can actually squeeze between the two cells. The fluid then moves along the lymphatic capillary, as indicated here. One other thing that we should note, and this is in comparison as well to the cardiovascular system, is that there are valves. Here we have indicated a valve that's open and a valve that's closed. Like in the venous portion of the cardiovascular system, lymph is under very low pressure. And so it is returned along the lymphatic vessels via the same processes that we saw in the cardiovascular system, namely muscle pumping and respiratory movements. Just like in the venous system, there are valves within the lymphatic capillaries and the lymphatic vessels to prevent backflow. We mentioned another difference between the lymphatic system and the cardiovascular system, namely the lymph nodes, as indicated in this picture we took a look at earlier. Let's take a closer look at a lymph node. If we move this image off to the side and zoom in on the lymph node, what we can see is that not just one lymphatic vessel enters into the lymph node, but many do. They're indicated here, where we show the lymph flowing in from those vessels, which are ultimately called afferent lymphatic vessels. The afferent lymphatic vessels means afferent going towards the lymph node. The lymph flows through the lymph node, and we'll talk about that a little more in a few moments here, but then exits the lymph node via the efferent lymphatic vessels. So what does the lymph node do? Here we show a couple other portions of the lymph node, the sinus and the nodule. Within these areas, there are cells of the immune system that we'll talk about a little bit later in this unit. But those cells of the immune system, as the lymph flows through, will remove any debris or bacteria or viruses or any other pathogens from the lymph fluid that has been picked up from the interstitial spaces of the tissues. So the lymph will move along the vessels, enter into the lymph node, and as it flows through, the immune system cells that we'll take a look at will remove those items, and then the cleaned out lymph will leave the lymph node via the efferent lymphatic vessels. If we take a close look at the human body and indicate all the lymph vessels that are throughout it, we can see that there are a couple main regions where you find a number of lymph nodes. Mostly they're actually at joints. And so as we can see up in the neck region, there are a number of lymph nodes that we call the cervical nodes. Those cervical lymph nodes are called that because cervical is referring to the neck region. If you remember back to the skeletal system, the upper portion of the vertebral column is made up of the cervical or neck vertebrae. We have axillary nodes. Axillary is a term referring to the armpit region. And so these are lymph nodes found within that region. Finally, we have the inguinal nodes, which are found in the groin region, the inguinal region of the body. As the lymph moves along the lymphatic vessels, just like in the cardiovascular system where many venules would connect to form larger and larger veins, the lymphatic vessels connect to form larger and larger lymphatic vessels. Eventually we get to two major lymphatic vessels that we actually call lymphatic ducts. Let's take a look at those two ducts. The first is the right lymphatic duct. I'm pointing to it here because it's actually coming from many lymphatic vessels, and then it will dump the lymph that has now been cleaned out into the subclavian vein, specifically the right subclavian vein that then enters into the superior vena cava. The second major duct is the thoracic duct, shown here running up through this individual's thoracic cavity. The thoracic duct then connects here to the left subclavian vein, and it dumps in the cleaned out lymph fluid back into the cardiovascular system in order for it, again, to go into the superior vena cava and then that fluid to be pumped around the body again. So we have these two major ducts, and one might think that, well, the right lymphatic duct drains the right side of the body and the thoracic duct maybe drains the left side of the body. But this system is unique in the sense of taking a look at this person's body, the right lymphatic duct only drains the upper right quarter of the body. The thoracic duct drains 75% approximately of the body's fluid.